Have you ever thought about what really changes the course of history? It's not always grand speeches or massive armies. Sometimes it's a quiet idea, a clever trick, a strange machine built in a wooden hut. During the Second World War, a country estate called Bletchley Park became the center for some of the most important thinking of the 20th century. Over 10,000 people worked there in total secrecy. Most of them were women. They weren't soldiers in the traditional sense. They were mathematicians, linguists, engineers, and even crossword puzzle champions. They fought a different kind of war. A war of the mind. Their job was to break the secret codes used by the German military. These codes were created by sophisticated machines and were thought to be unbreakable. Breaking them was like trying to solve a puzzle with millions of pieces, a puzzle that changed its shape every single day. The work done at Bletchley Park is often credited with shortening the conflict by years. But what did they actually invent there? It wasn't just about one machine or one genius. It was a whole ecosystem of innovation. They created not just machines, but new ways of thinking. New methods for organizing information, new fields of science. The secrets were so deep that many of the people who worked there went to their graves without telling anyone, not even their families, what they had done. What follows isn't a list of gadgets. It's a look at 21 different ideas, processes, and machines that came to life in that strange, secret place. Some are famous, others are almost completely forgotten, but each one tells a story about how human ingenuity can flourish under immense pressure. What secrets are still buried in the files? How did a group of academics in tweed jackets and sensible shoes help create the modern world? Number 21, could a stolen machine be an invention? The story of Bletchley Park often focuses on breaking codes created by others, but the people there had their own secrets to keep. They needed to send their own coded messages, and for that, they used a machine called the Typex. Now, here's the interesting part. The Typex wasn't strictly invented at Bletchley Park. It was developed before the conflict in the 1930s by the British Cryptographic Service. It was based on the German Enigma machine, but with crucial improvements. So why is it on this list? Because Bletchley Park's use and adaptation of it was an invention in itself. They created a secure communication network that was practically unbreakable. The Typex was a rotor cipher machine, just like Enigma. It had a keyboard where you typed a message. A series of rotating wheels, or rotors, scrambled the letters. The scrambled letters lit up on a lamp board. But the Typex had key advantages. Standard German military Enigma had 3 or 4 rotors. The Typex had 5. And 2 of those 5 rotors were stationary, which added a layer of complexity that was very difficult to reverse engineer. More importantly, the Typex had a printer. The operator didn't have to write down the letters from the lamp board one by one. The machine printed both the original plain text and the coded ciphertext. This made it much faster and reduced the chance of human error, a constant problem for the Enigma operators. At Bletchley, the Typex was the backbone of their own secure communications. When a vital piece of intelligence was decoded, it needed to be sent to commanders in the field. Sending it over an open line was impossible. They used Typex. This created a closed loop of information. They would break a German Enigma message and then use their own superior version of Enigma to securely transmit the results. This system was managed by people like Edward Travis, the operational head of Bletchley Park. He oversaw the flow of this ultra-secret information. The RAF also had a large Typex network. The integration of this machine into the vast Bletchley Park system was a logistical and procedural invention. It wasn't just a machine, it was a secure information pipeline. They even created special attachments for the Typex to make it compatible with other allied coding machines like the American CCM. This allowed for secure communication between different allied forces, a huge strategic advantage. The German codebreakers, who were very skilled, never managed to break the Typex system. They knew it existed, but its complexity stumped them. The work of Bletchley Park would have been useless if they couldn't securely share what they found. The Typex machine and the system built around it was the lock on their own front door. It kept their secrets safe while they were busy stealing everyone else's. But what don't we know? How many close calls were there where Allied messages sent by Typex were intercepted? We know the system was never broken, but how hard did the opposition try, and were there other, even more obscure British coding machines used for specific high-level tasks that have been completely lost to history. Number 20, how can a light bulb change the world? We think of computers as being made of silicon chips, but the first computers were made of glass, wire, and gas. They were powered by thousands of vacuum tubes. A vacuum tube is essentially a glass bulb with the air removed, containing electrodes to control an electric current. Think of it as a switch or an amplifier. In the 1940s, they were common in radios and other electronics, but they had a reputation for being unreliable. They burned out like light bulbs do. The common wisdom was that you couldn't build a machine with hundreds of them, let alone thousands. It would always be broken. This is where Tommy Flowers comes in. He was a post office research engineer. The post office in Britain was responsible for the telephone network, and they were at the cutting edge of electronic engineering. Flowers was an expert in vacuum tubes. He believed they could be reliable if you used them in the right way. His great insight was that most tubes failed when they were turned on or off. The heating and cooling stressed the components. But if you left a machine on all the time, the tubes would be stable and could run for ages. This idea was crucial for the invention of Colossus, the world's first programmable electronic computer. The earlier code-breaking machine, Heath Robinson, used electromechanical relays, which were slow and unreliable. Max Newman, a mathematician at Bletchley, knew they needed something faster to break the complex Lorenz cipher. He went to the post office research station at Dollis Hill for help. Tommy Flowers was there. He saw the problem and realized that electronics was the only answer. He proposed building a machine with around 1,500 vacuum tubes. The Bletchley Park leadership was skeptical. They thought it would never work, but Flowers was so confident that he started building it with his own money. He used specific types of tubes like thyrotrons and pentodes, which were very stable. The machine he designed, Colossus, used 1,500 tubes in its first version and a massive 2,500 in the Mark II version. And his theory was right. As long as it was left on, Colossus was incredibly reliable. It ran 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. The invention here wasn't the vacuum tube itself. It was the revolutionary idea of using them in massive quantities to perform logical operations at high speed. Flowers proved that large-scale electronic computing was possible. He tamed the unreliable vacuum tube and turned it into the building block of the computer age. His work, documented in papers like The Design of Colossus by A.W.M. Coombs, shows a deep understanding of practical electronics that the university mathematicians at Bletchley lacked. The specialized application of these tubes was an invention. Without Tommy Flowers' deep practical knowledge and his stubborn belief in the reliability of electronics, Colossus would never have been built. The Lorenz cipher might never have been broken, and the history of computing would look very different. So what are the unanswered questions? Flowers and his team were building on decades of post office research. How much of the groundwork for Colossus was laid in obscure telephone exchange projects from the 1920s and 30s? Were there other experimental electronic devices built at Dollis Hill that were cannibalized for the Colossus project? And how much of Flowers' personal research and notes were destroyed after the war in the name of secrecy? Number 19, could a lazy mistake become a powerful weapon? Sometimes the most brilliant breakthroughs come from exploiting someone else's mistake. Not a big catastrophic error, but a small lazy habit. In cryptography, these little human flaws are gold dust. One of the best examples from Bletchley Park is the story of the Silly. It wasn't a machine. It wasn't a complex mathematical formula. It was a simple observation about a German operator's girlfriend. Here's the problem. Bletchley faced with the Enigma machine. To read the traffic for a particular day, they needed to know the machine's settings for that day. This included which rotors to use and what their starting positions were. The operators had a daily setting sheet. For each message, they would choose a 3-letter key, for example, dog. They would type this key twice at the start of the message. So they type dog dog. But because of the way Enigma works, the machine would encrypt it as 2 different sets of 3 letters, for example, XHY, PQR. The code breakers at Bletchley could see this repeated pattern at the start of many messages. This gave them a way in. But the German command eventually realized this was a weakness. They changed the procedure. Now, the operator would only type the 3-letter key once. This made the codebreakers' job much harder. It took away their main entry point. The flow of intelligence from Enigma messages slowed down. They were desperate for a new weakness to exploit. Then someone in Hut 6, the section dealing with Army and Air Force Enigma, noticed something. They saw that some operators were lazy. They wouldn't pick a random three-letter key, they'd pick something easy to type. They would use keys like ABC or QWE, the top row of a German keyboard, or, even better, they would use their girlfriend's name. One operator in particular seemed to be sending messages from a station in the Balkans. He consistently used the same three-letter key, Sil. The Bletchley staff nicknamed him Silly. They figured it must be his girlfriend's name. This was more than just a funny story. It was a breakthrough. The codebreakers realized that operators were human. They made predictable choices. They started searching for these weak keys. They looked for keyboard patterns, initials, and common German names. Finding just one message with a weak key could give them the clue they needed to figure out the entire day's settings. Once they had the daily settings, they could read every message sent on that network for the rest of the day. This simple observation, probably made by one of the many young women doing the painstaking work of sorting through messages, became a standard code-breaking technique. They called it the silly hunt. It was an invention born not of mathematics, but of psychology. It was the understanding that the weak point in any security system is always the human being who uses it. So, what do we still not know? Who was the person who first spotted the silly pattern? Their name is lost to history. How many other pet names and shortcuts were used by operators that provided crucial breaks? And did the German cryptographic authorities ever realize that their operators' romantic habits were compromising their most secret codes? Number 18. What if a garden tool could break a code? The language matters. The people at Bletchley Park developed their own slang for everything. The German Abwehr intelligence service was called the Gardeners because their messages often contained the word Garten. So the process of breaking their codes was called gardening. This wasn't just a nickname, it was a whole system. A whole production line for decryption. And the gardening technique was one of the most successful and consistent operations at the park. The Abwehr used a version of the Enigma machine, but with a crucial difference. It had a moving reflector wheel. This made it much more complex than the standard Army version. For a long time, the Abwehr code was considered unbreakable. The breakthrough came from Dilly Knox, one of the original and most eccentric codebreakers from the pre-war period. He was a classicist, an expert in ancient texts who approached codebreaking like a literary puzzle. He led a small team, mostly women, in a section that was eventually housed in a cottage in the Bletchley Park grounds. Knox's team found a flaw. The Abwehr operators were notoriously sloppy. They often sent stereotyped messages with predictable phrasing. For example, a message might start and die group. To the group, Knox and his team realized they could use these predictable bits of text, which they called cribs, to work backwards. The real invention in hardening was the specific set of logical and statistical tricks they developed to exploit these cribs against the unique structure of the Abwehr Enigma. They created what were known as Knox's rods, which were sets of paper strips used to test out different possibilities and eliminate contradictions. It was a purely manual, intellectual process. It required immense concentration and a strange kind of intuition. The women on Knox's team, like Mavis Lover, later Mavis Beatty, and Margaret Rock, were central to this. They became masters of the technique. In 1941, Mavis Beatty used the gardening method to achieve one of the most important breakthroughs of the entire conflict. She broke a message that revealed the entire German intelligence network in the Balkans. This information was vital for the planning of subsequent operations in the Mediterranean. It was a huge success, all achieved with brain power, paper, and pencils. The gardening section was a testament to the fact that not all problems at Bletchley were solved with giant machines. Some were solved by a small group of brilliant people in a quiet room thinking. The system they invented was a repeatable, teachable method for breaking a specific, highly complex cipher. But what mysteries remain? Dilly Knox died before the conflict ended, and his notes were famously cryptic. How many of his techniques and insights were never fully written down and died with him? The work was so secret that the full stories of the women in this section are still only partially known. What other major intelligence coups did they achieve that remain buried in classified files? Number 17, how can knowing less make you smarter? In a place like Bletchley Park, secrecy was everything. The entire operation depended on the opposition not knowing that their codes were being read. If the secret got out, the Germans would change their systems, and the intelligence source would dry up overnight. So how do you keep a secret among 10,000 people? The answer was another invention, not of technology, but of management. It was the principle of need to know. This sounds simple, but Bletchley Park applied it with extreme rigor. The entire organization was compartmentalized. People worked in small teams in different wooden huts on very specific tasks. And you were not allowed to talk about your work with anyone outside your hut. Not your friends in the next hut over. Not your roommate. Certainly not your family. Most people had no idea what the person sitting next to them in the canteen did all day. Someone working on the Bombi machines had no idea what Colossus was. Someone transcribing messages in one language had no idea how they were being used by the analysts in another section. This was enforced by the Official Secrets Act, which everyone signed. The penalty for talking was severe. But it was also enforced by a strong sense of duty and a culture of silence. This system of extreme compartmentalization was pioneered by leaders like Commander Alistair Denniston and later Edward Travis. They understood that the biggest risk to security wasn't a single spy, but a slow leak of information. If one person knew two pieces of the puzzle and another person knew two different pieces, they might accidentally put them together and reveal the bigger picture. By ensuring almost no one saw the whole picture, they minimized this risk. The hut system itself was a physical manifestation of this principle. Hut 8, where Alan Turing worked on Naval Enigma, was a world away from Hut 6, which handled Army and Air Force Enigma. The Numenary, with its Colossus computers, was separate from the test tree, where other Lorenz methods were tried. This structure was an invention of organizational design. It was a way of managing a huge, complex project while maintaining almost perfect security. It was incredibly effective. The secrets of Bletchley Park were kept for decades after the conflict ended. The people who worked there, the Bletchley veterans, became famous for their reticence, but this secrecy came at a cost. It meant that different teams couldn't always share insights that might have helped each other. A trick discovered in Hut 6 might have been useful in Hut 8, but they might never have known about it. The need-to-know principle could sometimes become the need-not-to-know obstacle. It also placed an incredible psychological burden on the workers who carried these secrets alone for their entire lives. This raises some unsettling questions. How much progress was slowed down by this extreme secrecy? Were there brilliant ideas that never got off the ground because the right two people were never allowed to talk to each other? And what was the true long-term psychological cost for the thousands of men and women who were forced into a lifetime of silence? Number 16, could you get a job by solving a puzzle? How do you find the right people for a job that has never existed before? You can't put an ad in the paper saying code breakers wanted. The recruitment method used by Bletchley Park was itself a clever invention, a new way of identifying talent. They weren't just looking for soldiers. They were looking for a very specific type of mind. A mind that could see patterns where others saw only chaos. In the beginning, the recruitment was informal. It relied on the old boys' network of universities like Cambridge and Oxford. Mathematicians like Alan Turing, Gordon Welchman, and Max Newman were brought in because their professors knew someone in the intelligence services. But as the work expanded and they needed thousands more people, they had to get more creative. One of the most famous methods was a crossword puzzle competition. In 1942, a letter appeared in the Daily Telegraph newspaper inviting readers to try and solve the paper's cryptic crossword in under 12 minutes. The letter was placed by the War Office. Several people who completed the challenge were then discreetly invited to an interview, and from there recruited to work at Bletchley Park. It was a brilliant screening test. Solving a cryptic crossword requires a certain kind of lateral thinking, an ability to see multiple meanings in words, and a logical but flexible mind. These were exactly the skills needed for code breaking. But they recruited from other sources too. They brought in linguists who were experts in German. They needed people who understood the nuances of the language, military jargon, and common abbreviations. They recruited chess champions, bridge players, and anyone who had a talent for games of logic and strategy. The Women's Royal Naval Service, the WRENs, the Women's Auxiliary Air Force, the WAVs, and the Auxiliary Territorial Service, ATS, were huge sources of staff. Thousands of young women were recruited to operate the machines, manage the vast card indexes, and do the painstaking work of transcribing and sorting messages. Many of them were, chosen through aptitude tests that looked for accuracy, patience, and an eye for detail. This recruitment model was an invention. It threw out the old rules of class and background. What mattered was raw intellectual ability. It brought together a bizarre and brilliant collection of people who would never have normally worked together: tweed-wearing classics professors, young debutantes, post office engineers, and chess grandmasters. This diversity of thought was one of Bletchley's greatest strengths. A mathematician might see a statistical pattern, while a linguist might spot a human error. This unique mix of people, brought together by an unconventional recruitment system, created the innovative culture that made all the other inventions possible. But what about the people who didn't fit the mold? How many potential geniuses were overlooked because they didn't go to the right university or see the crossword in the paper? Were there more secret recruitment channels that we still don't know about? And how did they manage to vet thousands of people for security clearance so quickly and effectively? Number 15, what can you learn from a message you can't read? Sometimes the most important information isn't inside the message. It's on the outside. This is the core idea behind another of Bletchley Park's most important and often overlooked inventions: traffic analysis. Even if you can't decode a single word of a secret message, you can still learn a huge amount just by studying the patterns of how messages are sent. The section at Bletchley responsible for this was known as Hut 7. Think about it like this. Imagine you're watching an enemy's radio network. You can't understand their language, but you can see who is talking to whom, how often they talk, and when they talk. If you suddenly see a huge increase in radio traffic between a headquarters and a specific army group, you can guess that a major operation is being planned in that area. If a radio station that has been broadcasting from one location for months suddenly goes silent, and a new station with a similar signal appears somewhere else, you can deduce that a unit has moved. This is traffic analysis. The team in Hut 7, which included the intelligence expert Harry Hinsley, became masters of this craft. They would listen to the vast sea of coded German radio transmissions. Each operator had a unique fist, a distinctive way of tapping out Morse code, like a signature. The analysts could identify individual operators and track their movements. They gave them nicknames. They created a huge map of the opposition's entire radio network. They could identify which call signs belonged to which military units. This information was incredibly valuable on its own. It could provide clues about troop movements, the location of naval vessels, and the chain of command. But its real power came when it was combined with the decoded messages from the other huts. For example, the code breakers in Hut 8 might decrypt a message that mentions a planned operation, but with no specific location. The traffic analysts in Hut 7 could then look at their data and say, well, we've seen a massive spike in radio traffic around this particular port, and several naval call signs have just appeared there. Putting the two pieces of information together gave the Allies a complete picture. The system they invented was a way of extracting intelligence from noise. They used vast card indexes and wall charts to track thousands of call signs and frequencies. It was data analysis on a massive scale long before computers made it easy. This work, detailed in Hinsley's own official history, British intelligence in the Second World War, was less glamorous than breaking Enigma, but it was just as important. It provided the context, the framework that made the decrypted messages truly useful. It was the invention of a whole new discipline of intelligence gathering. But what don't we know about this secret world? The radio signals they listened to were ephemeral. How much information was lost simply because no one was listening at the right time? The skills of the analysts were based on experience and intuition. How many of their specific techniques and tricks were never written down? And were there ever mistakes where a misinterpretation of radio traffic led the Allies to a disastrously wrong conclusion? Number 14, how did Alan Turing listen to a machine's thoughts? Alan Turing is the most famous name associated with Bletchley Park. He is often called the father of computer science and artificial intelligence. But his work at Bletchley was very specific. He was a mathematician, and he brought a new kind of thinking to code breaking. The collection of techniques he developed, which became known as Turinger, was a profound invention. It was about finding the statistical ghost in the machine. The Enigma machine was designed to be random. It was supposed to turn a message into a meaningless jumble of letters with no patterns. But Turing realized it wasn't perfectly random. It had a tiny, almost imperceptible flaw. An Enigma machine could never encrypt a letter as itself. So if you typed the letter the encrypted letter could be anything except This seems like a small detail, but for a mind like Turing's, it was a huge clue. It meant that if you could find a likely piece of plain text, a crib, you could test it against the ciphertext. If the crib had an in the fourth position, and the ciphertext also had an in the fourth position, you knew instantly that your guess about the crib's position was wrong. You could eliminate that possibility. This was the starting point for Turingery. It was a whole collection of statistical methods for attacking the Enigma cipher. Turing developed these ideas in his 1940 paper, The Applications of Probability to Cryptography. He figured out how to use probability theory to score different possibilities. His methods could tell the code breakers which potential machine settings were more likely to be correct. This was crucial for the design of the bombing machine. The bomb didn't just test every possible setting. That would have taken far too long. It used Turing's logical and statistical tricks to quickly rule out vast numbers of incorrect settings. Another key part of Turingery was a technique for breaking Naval Enigma messages, which were much more difficult. He developed a statistical scoring system based on Bayesian inference. He created a measure of evidence he called a bon, which was related to the decibel used in acoustics. It was a way of weighing different pieces of evidence to find the most probable answer. This was incredibly advanced thinking for the time. He was essentially doing what we would now call data science, but with pencil and paper. He was inventing a new way to think about information and probability, all in the service of breaking a code. The techniques of Turingery were so powerful that they formed the intellectual foundation for much of the work done in WWII. But Turing's mind was a unique place. How much of Turingery was just formal mathematics and how much was his own strange intuition? His original papers on the subject were kept secret for decades. Are there still aspects of his methods that are not fully understood by historians? And what other brilliant, unrecorded ideas did he have during his time at the park? Ideas that were never pursued. Number 13, what was the secret of the leaning sacks? One of the strangest and most brilliant code-breaking tricks at Bletchley Park had a very strange name. It was called the Herival tip, or the Herivalism. It wasn't a machine, it was a guess. A very, very clever guess based on human psychology. It was invented by a young mathematician named John Herivel. He was only 21 when he arrived at Bletchley Park in early 1940. He was put to work in Hut 6 trying to break the daily Enigma keys. The problem was immense. They had to find the right settings every single day, starting from scratch. Herivel thought about the German machine operators. He imagined a young soldier, maybe tired or cold, sitting at his radio station. He has to set up his Enigma machine for the day. The daily settings sheet tells him which 3 rotors to put in the machine and what the ring setting for each rotor should be. The ring setting is an adjustable alphabet ring on the rotor. The operator is supposed to set this to a specific letter for each rotor. Then he is supposed to choose his own random 3-letter starting position for the rotors for his first message. Now, Herivel had a flash of insight. What if the operator was lazy? What if, after setting the rings to the day's setting, say RDM, he didn't bother to turn the rotors to a different random position? What if he just closed the lid and used RDM as his starting position for the message key, or a position very close to it? He reasoned that the physical act of setting the rings would leave the rotors in or near that position. The operator, in a hurry, might not bother to scramble them properly. It was a long shot, a complete guess about human behavior. But Herivel wrote a paper on it and convinced his boss, they started looking for it, they would take the day's ring settings, which they sometimes found from other sources, and test them as the potential message key. And it worked. Not every day, but often enough. Finding just one message that had been set up this way could give them the entire day's key. It was a massive shortcut. The team in Hut 6 started calling it the Hearable Tip. They would get a potential daily key and run around the hut shouting, "We've got a Hearable." The story goes that when they were waiting for the German radio networks to start up in the morning, the codebreakers would lean sacks against the wall. The angle of the sacks represented how confident they were that a Hearable Tip would come in that day. This invention was pure psychological profiling. It was about understanding that the person on the other end of the radio was not a perfect logical machine. They were a human being who got tired, bored, and took shortcuts. John Harrel's brilliant insight, documented in his own memoirs, Harrelismus and the German Military Enigma, gave Bletchley Park a powerful weapon. It reminds us that technology is always used by people, and people are always the weakest link, but the questions remain. How many operators actually made this mistake? Was it just a few careless individuals, or was it a widespread habit? Did the German authorities ever find out about this vulnerability and warn their operators? And what other similar psychological tricks did the Bletchley codebreakers use that were never given a catchy name and have been forgotten by history? Number 12, why would you build a machine you know will break? Before the electronic genius of Colossus, there was a mechanical monster. It was a strange, unwieldy machine nicknamed Heath Robinson. It was named after the famous cartoonist who drew ridiculously complicated contraptions for doing simple things. And the machine lived up to its name. It was a tangle of wires, pulleys, and whirring tapes. It was noisy, unreliable, and constantly broke down. But it was also a vital stepping stone to the computer age. Heath Robinson was built to solve a specific problem, breaking the Lorenz cipher, which the British codenamed Tunny. And Lorenz was a teleprinter cipher, far more complex than Enigma. It was used for high-level communications between German army commands. Breaking it by hand was almost impossible. The mathematicians Max Newman and Bill Tudde had figured out the logical structure of the Lorenz machine without ever seeing one. They knew they needed a machine to help them test their theories and find the daily settings. They went to the post office research station at Dollis Hill and the telecommunications research establishment at Malvern. The engineers there, including Tommy Flowers and C.E. Wynne Williams, took on the challenge. The machine they designed was an attempt to automate the logical processes that Tudde had developed. It used 2 loops of paper tape. One tape held the coded message. The other tape held the patterns generated by the wheels of the Lorenz machine. The machine's job was to read both tapes at high speed and count how many times certain logical conditions were met. The problem was speed. To be useful, the tapes had to move at thousands of characters per second. At that speed, the paper tapes with their sprocket holes for feeding would stretch and tear. Keeping the 2 tapes perfectly synchronized was a nightmare. The machine used a combination of electronic vacuum tubes for counting and electromechanical relays for other logic. It was a hybrid, and it was fragile. The engineers spent a huge amount of time just trying to keep it running. So, why was this unreliable machine an invention? Because it was the first of its kind. It was the first high-speed electronic counter and comparator. It proved that the basic concept of using a machine to break the Lorenz cipher was sound. It was a proof of concept. The frustrations of working with Heath Robinson are what directly led Tommy Flowers to propose building an all-electronic machine, Colossus. He was tired of the unreliable paper tapes and mechanical parts. He knew a fully electronic system would be faster and more reliable. So, Heath Robinson, the clumsy clattering failure, was the necessary parent of Colossus, the world's first computer. It was the invention that had to happen to show the way to a better one. But what don't we know about this mechanical beast? Only 2 photographs of it are known to exist. How many different versions and modifications were built? The engineers were constantly tinkering with it. What clever, unrecorded tricks did they invent just to keep the tapes from breaking? And were there other smaller special purpose machines built at Bletchley that were even stranger than Heath Robinson, machines that were used once and then completely dismantled and forgotten? Number 11, how do you turn a math department into a factory? At Bletchley Park, some of the most important inventions were not machines, but departments. They were new ways of organizing people and work. One of the most significant was the Numenry. It was named after its leader, the Cambridge mathematician Max Newman. The Numenry was the section created specifically to break the Lorenz cipher using machines. It was, in effect, the world's first computer center. The story starts with the discovery of the Lorenz cipher. After Bill Tuday's incredible intellectual feat of deducing the machine's structure, Newman realized that breaking the daily traffic would require automation. This led to the development of the Heath-Robinson machine, and then, crucially, the Colossus computers. But building a computer is one thing, using it effectively is another. Newman's great invention was the organizational system for doing just that. He recruited a team of mathematicians, engineers, and operators, mostly Wrens. He created a new kind of workflow. The raw coded messages would come in, the mathematicians would analyze them and prepare the data for the machine. The Wrens would then operate Colossus, feeding in the paper tapes and setting the switches according to the mathematician's instructions. The machine would run for hours, processing the data at incredible speed. The results would be printed out, and the mathematicians would analyze them to find the correct settings for the Lorenz machine. Once they had the settings, they could decode all the messages for that day. This was a radical new way of working. Before the Newmanry, code breaking was a solitary intellectual activity. It was done by scholars in quiet rooms. Newman turned it into an industrial process. He created a factory for decryption, with Colossus as the main production machine. He understood that the computer was not a magic brain. It was a tool, a very fast and powerful tool that needed skilled human operators and analysts to make it work. This partnership between the human mind and the electronic machine was the core of the Newmanry's success. People like Donald Michie and Jack Good were key mathematicians in this process, developing new statistical methods to get the most out of the machines. The Newmanry was housed in F Block at Bletchley Park. By the end of the conflict, there were 10 Colossus computers working around the clock. The intelligence they produced from the Lorenz traffic was codenamed Ultra. It gave the Allied leaders an unprecedented window into the thinking of the German High Command. The invention of the Newmanry was not just about the computer, it was about the entire system of people, processes, and technology. It was a prototype for the data processing centers that would become common decades later, but the history of the Newmanry is full of gaps. Because the Colossus computers were so secret, they were destroyed after the war, and all the blueprints were burned. The people who worked there were sworn to silence. How many clever programming tricks and operating procedures were developed by the Wrens and mathematicians that were never written down? What was the true processing power of the 10 Colossi working together, and did the intense 24/7 work in the heat and noise of the machine room have a lasting impact on the health of the people who worked there? Number 10, could you test a theory before building a machine? Ideas are cheap. Proving an idea works is hard. At Bletchley Park, they had a lot of ideas about how to break codes. Some of these ideas would require building a huge, expensive machine. But what if the idea was wrong? You would waste months of time and effort. To solve this problem, they invented another special department. It was called the testery, and its job was to test theories. The testery was set up in 1942, led by Major Ralph Tester. Its main target was the Lorenz cipher, the same high-level code being attacked by the Newmanry, but the testery used a completely different approach. They didn't have a Colossus computer. They did everything by hand. The people who worked in the testery were mostly linguists and German speakers, not mathematicians. Their job was to try and break the Lorenz code using intellectual and statistical methods. The head of the cryptanalysis section was Captain Jerry Roberts. He and his team developed a series of complex techniques. One of the most important was a method developed by Bill Tuday, which involved writing out the coded message in a huge grid and looking for statistical patterns. This was incredibly laborious work. It involved hours of counting letters and looking for repetitions. They used special charts and colored pencils. They were essentially doing the work of a computer, but with human brains. So why was this important? The testery served two purposes. First, it was a backup. If the machines in the Newmanry broke down, the hand methods of the testery could still produce results, albeit much more slowly. Second, and more importantly, it was a laboratory for new ideas. A mathematician could come up with a new statistical attack on the Lorenz cipher. Before they tried to program it into Colossus, they could give the theory to the testery. The team there would try it out by hand on a few messages. If it worked, they knew it was worth pursuing with the machines. If it didn't, the idea was discarded without wasting valuable machine time. The testery was an invention of process. It was a human-powered simulator. It was a way of de-risking innovation. The synergy between the testery and the numery was a key to Bletchley's success against Lorenz. The handbreakers in the testery would often find a way into a new cipher, cracking the first few messages of a new key. Once they had a foothold, they could pass the information to the numery, which would then use the power of Colossus to break the rest of the traffic. The existence of these two parallel, competing, and sometimes cooperating sections is a fascinating example of Bletchley's management style. But many questions about the testery remain. The hand methods they used were complex and relied on the skill and intuition of the operators. How many of these techniques were never properly documented and are now lost? The testery was a large department with hundreds of staff. What was the day-to-day life like for the people doing this incredibly demanding mental work? And were there ever moments of rivalry or conflict between the machine people in the numery and the hand people in the testery? Number 9, what if you could predict the future? This sounds like science fiction, but in a way, that's what a Bletchley Park invention called banburismus allowed them to do. It was a complex statistical process developed by Alan Turing for breaking naval Enigma messages. It was one of the most intellectually demanding jobs at the entire park, and it was done in Hut 8. It didn't use a big machine like the bomb or Colossus. It used brainpower, special paper, and a lot of probability theory. The problem with naval Enigma was its complexity. The German Navy used a system with more rotors than the other services, which meant there were far more possible settings to check. Using the bomb machine to check all of them would have taken too long. The daily settings would change before they could find the key. They needed a way to reduce the number of possibilities before they even put the problem on the bomb. Turing's solution was banburismus. It was based on a simple observation. In any language, some letters appear more often than others. In English is the most common. In German, it's also E. Turing realized that even after being scrambled by the Enigma machine, the ciphertext was not perfectly random. There were faint statistical echoes of the original message. His method was designed to find these echoes. The process worked like this. The codebreakers would get a batch of intercepted naval messages. They would punch them onto long strips of paper. They created a special kind of paper for this, printed in the nearby town of Banbury, which is how the process got its name. They would then lay 2 of these paper strips side by side and slide one along the other. They were looking for places where the letters repeated. For example, if the first tape had CABC and the second had CXBY, there was a repeat at the letter B. Turing developed a complex scoring system based on Bayesian statistics. He called the unit of evidence a bon and a tenth of a ban a decibon. Every time they found a repeat, they would look up the score for that particular pair of letters in a big book of tables. They would add up the scores. If the total score passed a certain threshold, it suggested that the 2 messages were encrypted using the same rotor settings and that the rotors were aligned in a specific way. This gave them a massive clue about the internal wiring of the rotors. They could string together a whole series of these deductions, creating a chain of likely rotor settings. This chain would dramatically reduce the number of settings the bomb machine had to test. It turned an impossible problem into a manageable one. The invention was the whole process, the special paper, the statistical tables, and the methodical way of working. It was performed by a small team of mathematicians, including Turing, Hugh Alexander, and Joan Clark. It required immense concentration. They would work in long, silent shifts, sliding the paper strips and calling out scores. It was a system that allowed them to find a faint whisper of a pattern in an ocean of random noise. But banburismus is still one of the most mysterious processes from Bletchley Park. The full statistical theory behind it is incredibly complex. Was Turing the only one who truly understood it, or did the others on his team contribute to the theory as well? The special Banbury sheets were all destroyed. What did they actually look like? And how much of modern statistical data analysis has its roots in this secret, forgotten technique developed in a smoky hut in the middle of a war? Number 8. How do you find a needle in a haystack? The size of a country. The Enigma machine had 159 million possible settings. Checking them all was impossible. The invention that made it possible to find the right one each day was a machine called the Bombe. It wasn't a computer in the modern sense. It was an electromechanical device designed for one single purpose, to find Enigma keys. And it was a beast. It was 7 feet tall, 7 feet wide, and weighed a ton. It was a mass of wires, plugs, and rotating drums. The original idea came from Polish codebreakers before the war. They had built a machine called the Bombe. But when the Germans added more complexity to the Enigma, the Polish machine became obsolete. At Bletchley Park, Alan Turing took their basic concept and redesigned it. But the real engineering genius who made it work was Harold Doc Keane from the British tabulating machine company BTM. The Bletchley Park bomb was a collaboration between the mathematical genius of Turing and the practical engineering of Keane. Gordon Welchman, another Bletchley mathematician, also made a crucial improvement by adding a device called a diagonal board, which made the machine even more powerful. Here's how it worked, in a simple way. The bomb didn't try to decode the message, it looked for contradictions. The codebreakers first needed a crib, a piece of text they were almost certain was in the message. For example, German weather reports often started with the same phrase. They would take this crib and the corresponding piece of coded text. They would then program this relationship into the bomb using a large plug board on the back, like an old telephone exchange. The machine had sets of rotating drums that replicated the rotors of the Enigma machine. The bomb would then start running through all the possible rotor settings at high speed. The drums would spin, creating a loud, clattering noise like 1,000 knitting needles. For each setting, the machine would check if it was logically possible for the crib to encrypt to the ciphertext. It used Turing's insight that a letter can't be encrypted as itself. Most of the time, the machine would find a logical contradiction. For example, it would conclude that for this setting to be correct, the letter A would have to be encrypted as A. Since this was impossible, that setting was ruled out. The machine would continue spinning. When it found a setting where there were no contradictions, it would stop. This didn't mean it had found the right answer. It just meant it had found a possible answer. A light would come on and an operator, usually a wren, would come and record the settings. They would then test this possible setting on an actual Enigma machine. Usually, it was a false alarm, but sometimes it would be the right one. And then they had the key for the day. Over 200 bombs were built. They were housed in secret outstations away from Bletchley Park itself to protect them from bombing. The sound in these machine rooms was deafening. The wrens who operated them did a vital, repetitive, and physically demanding job 24 hours a day. But there are still things we don't know. The blueprints for the bomb were destroyed. The modern reconstructions are based on fragments of information and memory. Are there subtle details of its design that we have gotten wrong? How many different versions of the bomb were built for different types of ciphers? And what was the exact contribution of Gordon Welchman's diagonal board, a feature so secret it wasn't revealed until decades after the war? Number 7. How do you organize 1,000,000 secrets? Imagine you are receiving 3,000 secret messages every single day. Each message contains names of people, places, military units, and technical terms. Some of this information is vital. Some is trivial. You need a way to connect it all. You need to know if the Colonel Schmidt mentioned in a message today is the same Colonel Schmidt mentioned in a message from 6 months ago. You need a system to cross-reference every single piece of information. You need a search engine. But this was the 1940s. There were no computers to do this. The invention that solved this problem was Bletchley Park Central Index. It was a gigantic cross-referenced card index. It was the brain and memory of the entire operation. It was housed in Block C and staffed by hundreds of women. The scale of it is hard to comprehend. By the end of the conflict, it contained millions of cards. Each card represented a single piece of information, a person, a place, a call sign, a piece of military jargon. The system was meticulously designed. When a message was decrypted and translated, an indexer would go through it with a red pen. They would underline every piece of information that might be important. A card would then be created for each underlined item. If the item was already in the index, the new information like the date and message number would be added to the existing card. This meant that an intelligence officer could go to the index and ask to see everything Bletchley knew about a particular German general, or a specific submarine, or a town in France. The indexers would be able to pull all the relevant cards in minutes. This wasn't just a simple filing system. It was a complex relational database built from paper and cardboard. The women who ran it, under the leadership of figures like Professor Leonard Palmer, were not just clerks. They were information architects. They had to make decisions about what was important enough to be indexed. They had to be incredibly accurate and consistent. A single misplaced card could mean a vital connection was missed. The central index was the engine that turned raw, decrypted data into usable, structured intelligence. It allowed the analysts to see the bigger picture, to connect the dots between seemingly unrelated messages. In his book, The Secret Life of Bletchley Park, Sinclair McKay describes the index as the pulsating heart of the entire site. Without the central index, the thousands of messages decrypted every day would have been a useless flood of information. It was the invention that made sense of it all. It was the unsung hero of the Bletchley Park story. The machines like the bomb and Colossus get the glory, but their output would have been meaningless without this vast human-powered database. But what are the lingering mysteries of the index? The index itself was destroyed after the war. No one knows for sure exactly how large it was. We have descriptions, but no complete picture of its intricate cross-referencing system, who designed the original classification system for the index, and what incredible world-changing secrets were held on those millions of cards, secrets that were burned to ashes in the name of post-war security. Number 6. What is the most powerful tool in a codebreaker's kit? It's not a machine, it's not a formula, it's a simple 4-letter word crib. A crib is a piece of plain text that you are very confident appears in a coded message. The concept of a crib is as old as code breaking itself. But at Bletchley Park, they turned the process of finding and using cribs into a science. The systematic use of cribs was one of their most important and productive inventions. Finding a good crib was an art. The crib room, part of Hut 6, was dedicated to this task. The people who worked there were not mathematicians. They were linguists, classicists, and people with a deep understanding of the German military. They had to put themselves inside the mind of the German soldier or administrator who sent the message. What would they be likely to say? They found cribs everywhere. German weather reports were a goldmine. They were often sent at the same time each day and contained predictable words like wetter weather or the names of locations. Routine administrative messages were also great. They often contained standard phrases like "I'm die Grupp" to the group or "Nix zu melden," nothing to report. Even a simple number could be a crib. The number 1 was very common. The crib finders knew all the German military jargon, abbreviations, and even the sloppy habits of individual radio operators. They knew that a certain officer always signed off his messages in the same way. Once they had a likely crib, the real work began. They had to figure out where in the coded message the crib appeared. This involved a lot of clever guesswork and logical deduction. They would test the crib in different positions. They used Turing's rule that a letter can't be encrypted as itself to rule out many positions quickly. If a crib fit perfectly, it was like finding the key to a locked door. This crib and its corresponding piece of ciphertext was the raw material that was fed into the bomb machine. The bomb could not work without a crib. The whole massive industrial process of breaking Enigma depended on the quiet, intellectual work of the people in the crib room. It was a perfect partnership of human intuition and mechanical brute force. The crib finders would provide the clue, and the bomb would use it to find the answer. The work of the crib room, as detailed in the memoirs of many Bletchley veterans, was central to the entire operation. It was a constant, daily battle of wits. So what do we still wonder about the crib room? The work was based on intuition and experience. How were new crib finders trained? Was there a secret manual of common German phrases and habits? We know they kept records of successful cribs. What did those records look like, and what was the most unlikely crib that ever led to a breakthrough? And how often did a brilliant guess by a crib finder turn out to be completely wrong, sending the bomb operators on a wild goose chase for hours? Number 5. Could an old building be an invention? This seems like a strange question. How can a building be an invention? But at Bletchley Park, the way they organized their workspace, the famous Hut system, was a key part of their success. It was a new way of structuring a secret project. It was an invention of architecture and management. When the government code and cipher school first moved to Bletchley Park in 1939, they worked in the main mansion house. But the project grew so quickly that they started building simple wooden huts on the grounds. These huts were cold, drafty, and basic. But they were also incredibly effective. Each hut was given a specific function. Hut 8 worked on Naval Enigma, or Hut 6 on Army and Air Force Enigma. Hut 3 translated and analyzed the intelligence from Hut 6. Hut 4 did the same for the naval intelligence from Hut 8. Hut 11 housed the bombing machines. Hut 7 was for traffic analysis, and so on. This system did two things. First, it enforced the need-to-know principle. By physically separating the different teams, it made it much harder for secrets to leak. People rarely visited huts other than their own. Second, it allowed for specialization. Each hut became a world-leading center of excellence in one specific, narrow field. The people in Hut 8 became the undisputed experts on Naval Enigma. The people in the Numenry became the experts on Colossus. This focus allowed them to develop deep knowledge and incredibly efficient workflows. But the hut system was not completely rigid. There was a constant flow of information between certain huts. A decrypted message from Hut 6 would be sent by a messenger to Hut 3 for analysis. A request for information might go from Hut 3 to the central index in Block C. There was a system of chutes and messengers that connected this sprawling campus of wooden buildings. This structure, a mix of strict separation and controlled communication, was a unique solution to a unique problem. It allowed thousands of people to work on a top secret project with remarkable efficiency and security. It was an organizational structure that evolved organically out of necessity. It wasn't designed by a management consultant. It was invented on the fly by people like Commander Denniston and Edward Travis. The very layout of the park, with its paths and fences and checkpoints, was part of the invention. It was a physical machine for processing information where the components were buildings and the moving parts were people. But what don't we know about the daily life of the huts? The official histories focus on the work, not the culture. What were the rivalries and friendships between the huts? We know Hut 8, the Puka academic hut, looked down on some of the others. How did this affect collaboration, and how many informal after-hours conversations on the lawns between the huts led to breakthroughs that were never officially recorded? Number 4, what if the enemy gave you the key to his secrets? The single most important breakthrough at Bletchley Park was breaking the Enigma cipher. But this was not an invention that happened in a single moment. It was a long process that built on the work of others, and the most crucial early work was done not in Britain, but in Poland. In the 1930s, the Polish Cipher Bureau, led by mathematicians Marian Rejewski, Jerzy Rzycki, and Henryk Zagalski, did something incredible. They were the first to use mathematics to analyze the Enigma machine. The German military sold a commercial version of Enigma, and the Poles bought one. They then worked out the wiring of the military rotors. They developed techniques and even built early code-breaking machines, the Bomba and the Zagalski sheets. For several years before the conflict started, the Poles were secretly reading German messages. But in late 1938, the Germans increased the complexity of the Enigma, adding more rotors. The Polish methods stopped working. They knew they could not continue their work alone. In a secret meeting in the woods near Warsaw in July 1939, just weeks before the invasion of Poland, the Poles made a momentous decision. They gave all of their research to the British and French. They gave them a replica Enigma machine and explained all of their mathematical techniques. This gift was the foundation on which everything at Bletchley Park was built. Alan Turing and the other early arrivals at Bletchley did not start from scratch. They started with the brilliant work of the Polish Cipher Bureau. They took the Polish ideas and improved upon them. Turing's bomb was a much more powerful and flexible version of the Polish Bomba. The invention at Bletchley was the scaling up and industrialization of the Polish methods. The Poles had proved it was possible. Bletchley Park turned that possibility into a reliable daily source of intelligence. So the invention here is a complex one. It was the Anglo-Polish collaboration that broke Enigma. Without the Poles' initial breakthrough and their incredible generosity, Bletchley Park's work would have been delayed by years if it was possible at all. The story is powerfully told in books like Dermot Turing's X, Y, and Z, which details the secret cooperation. It's a reminder that great inventions are rarely the work of a lone genius. They are often built on the forgotten work of others. But this history raises some difficult questions. For decades after the conflict, the British government downplayed the Polish contribution, taking most of the credit. Why was this crucial part of the story kept secret for so long? What other specific techniques and insights did the Poles share in that 1939 meeting that have been lost to history? And how did the individual Polish codebreakers who had to flee their country feel when they saw their work being continued in secret without them? Number 3, how do you rebuild a machine you've never seen? This sounds like an impossible task, but it's exactly what the codebreakers at Bletchley Park did with the Lorenz cipher machine. The breaking of Lorenz, codenamed Tunny, is arguably an even greater intellectual achievement than breaking Enigma. It was a story of pure deduction. The Lorenz machine was used for top-level teleprinter communications. The British had no idea what it looked like or how it worked. All they had were the coded messages. The breakthrough came in August 1941. A German operator made a mistake. He had to retransmit a long message. Crucially, he used the same key setting for both messages, but he made a few small typing errors in the second version. This was a catastrophic error. It meant the British now had 2 slightly different messages that had been encrypted with the exact same key. This precious pair of messages was given to John Tiltman, one of Bletchley's most senior codebreakers. He was able to use the differences between the 2 messages to work out the original, plain German text. But more importantly, he could also work out the stream of characters that the Lorenz machine had used to encrypt the message. This stream of characters was the key. He passed this key to a young mathematician named Bill Tute. And this is where the invention happened. Tute spent the next few months analyzing that single stream of key characters. He had no machine, just paper and pencil. He used statistical techniques to look for patterns and repetitions. He eventually deduced that the key was generated by a machine with a series of rotating wheels. He figured out how many wheels there were. He figured out how many teeth were on each wheel. He worked out the entire logical structure of a machine he had never seen. It was a feat of reverse engineering that has been compared to deducing the structure of a dinosaur from a single fossilized bone. 2 days' work, laid out in his 1942 paper Fish and I, was the foundation for the entire attack on Lorenz. His deductions allowed Max Newman to propose building a machine to automate the process, which led to Heath Robinson and then Colossus. The invention was Tute's intellectual model of the Lorenz machine. It was a blueprint created entirely from logic and mathematics. It was a purely mental construction that was so accurate. It allowed engineers to build a machine to defeat the real thing. And it is one of the most stunning examples of pure cryptanalysis in history. But the story is not without its mysteries. Tute was a quiet and modest man. In his own accounts, he makes his breakthrough sound like a simple, logical process. But was there a moment of intuitive genius, a flash of insight that is not captured in the official reports? How much did he rely on the work of others in his section? And are there still parts of Tute's original mathematical analysis that are not fully appreciated or understood today? Number 2, how could one wooden hut change the world? The bomb machine broke Enigma codes. The Colossus computer broke Lorenz codes. These were the 2 main pillars of Bletchley Park's success. But what was the single most important piece of intelligence they ever produced? Many historians would point to the information that came from breaking the naval Enigma cipher, which the German Navy called Triton, and Bletchley Park codenamed Shark. The work was done in Hut 8. For a long period in the conflict, the German Naval Command used a particularly complex version of the Enigma machine. For 10 long months in 1942, Bletchley Park was unable to read their messages. This period was known as a blackout. During this time, Allied shipping in the Atlantic suffered heavy losses from naval vessels whose positions they could not track. The pressure on Hut 8, led by Alan Turing, and later Hugh Alexander, was immense. Breaking back into Shark was a top priority. It required a combination of all the techniques Bletchley had to offer, They needed cribs, but naval messages were harder to predict than army ones. They needed the bomb machines, but the extra complexity of the naval Enigma meant they had to build special, faster bombs. And they needed the brilliant statistical techniques of Bambarismus, developed by Turing, to reduce the number of possibilities. The breakthrough finally came in December 1942. It was a combination of luck and hard work. A captured codebook gave them some clues. And the relentless work of the WWII team finally found a way in. Once they broke the first message, they were able to stay on top of the cipher for most of the rest of the conflict. The invention here was not a single machine or technique, it was the entire system that WWII created to attack the most difficult cipher they faced. It was the combination of the bomb, Bambarismus, brilliant crib finding, and sheer determination. The intelligence that flowed from WWII after they broke Shark was transformative. It allowed the Allies to reroute their convoys away from enemy naval packs. It allowed them to pinpoint the location of supply ships. Historians like Sir Harry Hinsley have argued that this single intelligence success was the most critical factor in the battle for the Atlantic. And that battle was the key to the entire Allied war effort. Without the supplies coming across the ocean, Britain could not have continued to fight. The work done in that one wooden hut had a direct and massive impact on the outcome of the entire conflict. But what are the unanswered questions? The 10-month blackout in 1942 was a desperate time. How close did Bletchley Park come to giving up on naval Enigma entirely? What was the human cost of the intense pressure on the small team in WWII, and were there other, even more secret sources of information, perhaps from spies or captured material, that contributed to the final breakthrough, sources that have never been declassified? Number one, did a secret machine accidentally invent the future? What was the most important invention to come out of Bletchley Park? You could argue for the bomb, or for the breaking of Enigma, but the invention with the longest and most profound legacy was a machine called Colossus. It was designed for one purpose, to help break the Lorenz cipher. But in solving that problem, its creators, led by the post office engineer Tommy Flowers, accidentally invented the future. Colossus was the world's first programmable electronic digital computer. Let's break that down. It was programmable. Unlike the bomb, which was hardwired for a single task, Colossus could be reprogrammed to perform different logical operations. The program was not stored in memory like a modern computer. It was set by plugging in cables and flipping switches. But it was programmable nonetheless. It was electronic. It didn't use mechanical relays like earlier calculating machines. It used 1,500 vacuum tubes, later 2,500, in the Mark II version to perform calculations at a speed that was previously unimaginable. And it was digital. It processed information in the form of binary pulses, the zeros and ones that are the foundation of all modern computing. Colossus was a monster. It was huge, filled a large room, and generated immense heat. It read the coded message from a loop of paper tape at a staggering 5,000 characters per second. Its job was to perform a statistical analysis on the ciphertext, comparing it against the patterns generated by a simulation of the Lorenz machine. It counted the results and printed them out. It did in hours what would have taken the human codebreakers in the test 3 weeks. By the end of the conflict, there were 10 Colossi working around the clock in the numenary. They provided vital intelligence about the highest levels of the German command. But the story of Colossus is also a story of secrecy. After the war, Churchill ordered that most of the Bletchley Park machines be destroyed and the blueprints burned. The very existence of Colossus was a state secret for over 30 years. The engineers and mathematicians who built and operated it were sworn to silence. Because of this, the official history of computing was written without it. For a long time, the American ENIAC, built in 1946, was considered the first electronic computer. We now know that Colossus was operational almost 2 years earlier. The legacy of Colossus is immense. Many of the people who worked on it, like Alan Turing and Max Newman, went on to become pioneers of post-war computer science in Britain. They took the ideas and principles they had developed in secret at Bletchley and used them to design some of the world's first stored program computers at Manchester University and the National Physical Laboratory. The invention of Colossus was a moment when history changed. It was the birth of the digital age. hidden away in a secret hut, built to solve a single urgent problem. But the secrecy has left us with some of the biggest questions of all. Because the blueprints were destroyed, could our modern reconstruction of Colossus be missing some key feature? Tommy Flowers and his team built the first one in just 11 months. How was this incredible speed possible? And the biggest question of all, if the existence of Colossus hadn't been kept secret for so long, would Britain and not the United States have dominated the early decades of the computer industry? Did the act of keeping the secret seed the future that Bletchley Park had invented?